Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, the resignation of Tshwane Mayor Randall Williams has added to concerns about the future of South Africa under coalition governments. Now, Williams, who announced his resignation yesterday, said that he would be leaving in the interest of a multi-government coalition and not out of frustration. A statement issued by the ANC's regional secretary, George Matjila, welcomed Williams's departure, saying that it is his final act of cowardice. Now, the resignation, which will see a new mayor in just over a year, is part of the yo-yoing that we've seen as a country and that we've just about become accustomed to at the local government sphere since municipalities have come under coalition governments. Political analyst Professor Bheki Mngomezulu says that South Africa is not yet ready for coalition politics, as many coalitions have led to disruption. Professor Mngomezulu is the director for the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. He joins us now virtually. Professor, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much, Sakina, for having me. Good morning to your viewers.
So the latest in a long line of seemingly disastrous coalitions at municipal level has seen now the resignation of the Tshwane mayor. The ANC saying that the outgoing executive mayor is running away from accountability when it comes to that adverse audit finding of the Auditor General, and they also complain about the dilapidated state of the city, no service delivery, and also a lack of coherent leadership from him and his entire exec. So what do you make? What's your assessment of the performance of Mayor Randall Williams as he exits, Professor?
No, thank you very much for that question, Sakina. In a way, I've been vindicated, because when I made the statement that South Africa is not ready for coalition politics, some people said that I was just daydreaming. But each and every day we see these coalitions being unstable. And then, of course, you see smaller parties that have the lowest number of seats making a lot of noise. And then subsequently, we see service delivery being negatively affected. So the issue that you are referring to now, that of Randall Williams, there have been a number of issues that have been happening in that municipality, including, of course, the proposal that the AG found that was not done correctly, and then, of course, the water treatment plant. So those were adverse findings, which then, of course, dent the image of the coalition parties that are in charge of Tshwane. And now in this case, he says that he's exiting the stage in order to ensure that the coalition remains strong. If that was the case, why didn't he leave before the AG made the findings? So basically, it tells you two things. One, these coalitions are coalitions that are put together for political expediency and not necessarily taking the interests of the citizens first. And then secondly, it tells you that these coalitions are based on lies, blatant lies. That is why politicians will say one thing and do the other. And it's going to continue. This is not the first and this is not the last.
So when you say these coalitions are based on lies, let's just expand on that a little further, please, Prof.
It starts off when people are canvassing during elections. I will know that politicians will say, I want to save my people. I want to deliver services. You and I know that is a lie, because once they assume the position, you will see a number of them even relocating. You elect them on the basis that they understand your situation, they are your neighbors, you live with them, and then immediately after they've been elected into the position, they then go to better places because they now have the money and they can afford. That is one thing. And then secondly, when they enter into these coalitions, they don't come back to you and I as the electorate to seek a fresh mandate and say, you wanted us to lead you, but unfortunately we didn't meet the threshold to allow us to run the municipality. We are now planning to forge relations with Party X. They don't do that. These coalitions are decided upon in boardrooms amongst politicians, and they first ask the question, what is in it for me? And then the answer they get will then decide or dictate which political party they align themselves with. And then once in office, they do anything and everything to amass wealth. So in other words, these coalitions are done for self-aggrandizement as opposed to assisting the people on the ground, people who have voted them into office. So that's why I'm saying that by and large, these coalitions are based on lies. That is why you'll find them not being sustained, because lies have a short lifespan.
So your view is clear, Prof. You say that, South Africa is simply not ready for coalition politics. The electorate, on the other hand, has gone this route, one would imagine, because they have seen that single-party dominance has not had the desired effect. People have not seen the sort of service delivery outcomes that they would have hoped for. So they thought, okay, let's split these votes and see if maybe we get people or parties to govern collectively together, whether there'd be a different outcome. Unfortunately, what we have been saddled with now is this instability whereby these coalitions are so fluid, you don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. But I suppose at the end of the day, what South Africans want, what the electorate is after, is service delivery. So how do we get to that point?
You know, Sakina, truth be told, this political ignorance does not only affect politicians, it also affects the citizenry. There are people who work on the wrong assumption that if you remove the ANC, for example, I'm making the ANC as an example because it has been the governing party nationally and in a number of these municipalities. If you remove the ANC as the governing party and then you bring together the smaller parties, services will be improved. They work on that wrong assumption, only to find that once they've done that, they remove the ANC because it tends to be the common enemy, so to speak, and then those smaller parties forge relations which seem to be working for a month or two, and then reality sinks in and they realize that they made a mistake. But by then, it will mean that they've in fact made a mistake, they have to live with it. So like in most of these municipalities, what has been happening is that in the 2021 local government election, the ANC had the largest number of votes. But because people were disgruntled with the ANC, understandably so, they then said, okay, fine, let us remove the ANC, let us split our vote, let us allow the smaller parties to form coalitions, and working on the fact that there is no legislation saying that if you have the largest number of votes, you should be the one given an opportunity to form a coalition government. There is no legislation to that effect, and people are aware of that. Then they said, okay, let us bring together these smaller parties, hopefully then our lives will be improved. They do that, they eliminate the ANC, then the smaller parties come together, only to find that it's like you are an egg, you are in a frying pan, you say it is hot, you jump out thinking that life is better out there, and you jump straight into the fire. The situation gets even worse, and by the time that happens, of course, you realize that what you thought was going to be the outcome is in fact the direct opposite. So I think that this ignorance is not only affecting politicians, it is also affecting voters. I hope that going forward we realize that we need legislation that will do two things. One, attend to the Electoral Act, and then two, amend the Constitution so that the party with the largest number of votes, even if it doesn't meet the threshold, should be the one given an opportunity to form a coalition. If you form what I normally refer to as a grand alliance, the grand alliance is a coalition that is formed by two or three bigger parties. Then in that case, you stand a better chance to negotiate because there are not too many of them. The moment you bring 5, 6, 7 parties together, that is a recipe for disaster because they are all reading from different scripts and they are not going to agree on a number of things, and services will not be delivered.
So let's take the example of the city of Tshwane once again. In this instance, who should take responsibility for the audit outcomes, the adverse audit outcomes? Because you now have a coalition government. The DA is constantly telling us that they govern wonderfully well where they govern, and the outcomes are there for all to see. But who then should take responsibility for the city of Tshwane? Is it the Democratic Alliance or is it the coalition collective?
Let me start with this wrong narrative that the DA governs well wherever it governs. I've lived in Cape Town for a number of years, over 10 years to be exact. And you get this narrative that the Western Cape, which is run by the DA, is the best run province. Go to Khayelitsha, go to Kukuletu, go to Nyanga, and see if indeed there is something that can be seen there to authenticate that particular narrative. It's not there. That is just one thing. But to come back to your question, on the issue of Tshwane, there are two sides to the story. One, you can blame the coalition as a collective, but then on the other hand, you can blame the DA as the leader of that collective. Because most of the concerns that are being raised by coalition partners, including Action SA and many others, is that the DA forgets that it didn't win that municipality. In fact, it is part of the coalition. So in other words, the DA should be treating itself as one of the many parties that constitute the coalition. But then the DA makes a mistake of thinking that it won the election and then it invited the smaller parties to govern with it, which is not the case. So therefore, it means that if we want to blame someone, both of them are to blame, that is the collective and the DA. But then accused number one will be the DA by virtue of the fact that they are leading the coalition. Accused number two will be the coalition because collectively, there are decisions that they made because Randall Williams did not take a unilateral decision whenever he came to certain conclusions. There is a mayoral committee which is constituted by these alliance partners. So basically, they are all to blame, although at different levels.
Now, Professor, you also, just getting back to coalitions, you say that if you compare South Africa and what's happening here to countries like Australia, India, or any of these Scandinavian countries, or Germany as an example, African countries in general and South Africa in particular still have a long way to go in terms of getting to grips with coalition politics. So just give us a sense of how those countries handle these coalitions that make it successful, as opposed to how we are faring and what makes us fail.
No, that's a very critical question, Sakina. You know, in order to get into coalition politics, the first step that you need to take is to understand how coalition politics work. That is number one. Number two, you understand different types of coalitions. There is what we refer to as pre-election coalition. So pre-election coalition means that different parties will start engaging one another long before an election, so that by the time they go to their voters, they then make sure that they try to find middle ground between themselves and the other potential coalition partners, so that they factor in whatever decisions they want to make into their election manifestos. Then it's easier after an election to then say, okay, we were unable to reach the threshold for us to run this municipality or this province or this country. Therefore, these are the parties we had discussed with. Then let us go back to them and then let us seal the deal. That is pre-election coalition. Most of the coalitions that we have in South Africa fall under what we call post-election coalition. Those ones are usually taken randomly, and then of course they are done for political expediency and nothing else. You recall that there are politicians who will tell you that I'm not going to work with the ANC because of APCD, either because they are thieves or because they are corrupt, whatever statements they make. And they are doing that after an election. And they say want to get rid of the ANC from this particular municipality. Okay, you do that because the ANC then becomes a common enemy. But you don't have anything of substance which brings you together as coalition partners. So that is a recipe for disaster because it's an afterthought. Forming a coalition is an afterthought. It's not something that was pre-planned. So that is one of the things that then lead me to the conclusion that we don't even understand what this coalition politics entail, and therefore they are not sustainable. Then lastly, the other thing that we should consider is what I've always referred to as the Grand Alliance, which I also mentioned earlier on, that instead of bringing too many political parties together, identify a few of the bigger parties, see if you can find common ground, and then say we can compromise on this, we can compromise on that, then we can find a point of convergence. Then in that case, you will be in a position to bring together at least two or a maximum of three political parties. The countries we're referring to, the likes of India, the likes of Australia, Germany, and some Scandinavian countries, the reason why their coalitions have survived is because they don't bring too many parties together. It's a grand alliance, and it's done before an election.
Well, Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, thank you so much for your time. Professor Mngomezulu is the director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University, and discussing there with us the concerning issue of coalitions and the way they've played out in South Africa, and also what the future may hold for South Africa under coalition governments. And if you like, tell us what your experience has been and what your views are in this regard at Morning Live SABC.